The first time Maya Okoro saw the video, she refused to believe it. What arrived in her inbox at 2:13 a.m. was cinematic in the worst way. A high-resolution clip showing the mayor of a coastal city confessing, in a moist, weary voice, to an act that would append an entire procurement scandal. The clip was staged like a confessional. Tight framing, a shallow depth of field, the kind of cinematic lighting that turned pores into landscapes. The problem, at first glance, was simple and terrible. The mayor had been at a public event across town that same night. Dozens of people had seen him on stage. The mayor's press team provided time-stamped photographs. The mayor denied the video. His denial felt small and ordinary, like a man fighting a smear. The clip, however, had teeth. Maya is an investigative journalist who has spent a decade tracking corruption stories that occupy the shadowlands between public policy and private gain. She is cautious by temperament and hungry by trade. The clip demanded a kind of hunger she had not planned for. It smelled like a fraud built on pixels and conviction. It smelled like something the new generation of criminals had learned to build. Believable lies that looked like truth. She forwarded the clip to Malik Chen, who runs a small cyberforensics unit inside a regional prosecutor's office. Malik replied within 15 minutes. He wanted a meeting. They convened, trading glances over a whiteboard littered with evidence chains and a forensic hash that refused to hold. Between them, a pattern began to emerge. Voices had been cloned, micro-expressions matched, and digital fingerprints that once betrayed simple forgeries were absent. The clip wasn't just fake, it was authored by a new architecture of deceit. Synthetic personas, adaptive deepfakes, and a flourishing black market that sold identity at scale. When they started to thread victim statements together, bank transfers that followed the release of doctored videos, threatened extortion backed by plausible-sounding audio of loved ones, what looked like isolated frauds hardened into a coherent anatomy. Someone had built a system that let criminals impersonate the most intimate parts of a person. Their voice, their face, the cadence of their guilt. That system scaled. And where it scaled, it could be weaponized. Maya and Malik, the journalist and the investigator, began to trace the traces. This is their story. The story of how a network of synthetic identities, a bookshelf of cloned voices, and a suite of generative tools turned privacy into an instrument of coercion. It is also the story of the people who woke one morning to find their lives repurposed as currency. Lovers blackmailed with the sound of their own laughter. CEOs compelled to approve transfers after receiving a call that reproduced the exact timbre of a trusted deputy. Entire communities gaslit by perfectly staged footage designed to shift public will. The prologue is the quiet before the choir of alarms. It is the first thread pulled from a sweater that would soon unravel. In a newsroom window splashed with rain, Maya and Malik watch the footage run on a loop, each pass revealing new details and new lies. The city beyond is unaware. The criminals have not yet been named, but the machine hums. The apartment belonged to a coder named Ibrahim Mensa, known to friends as Ebo. He was not the architect of the large scheme. He was a technician who specialized in stitching voice prints into plausible speech and mapping facial micro-expressions to pixel arrays. He called himself a mixologist in chat rooms, someone who could blend voice source A with face source B and a gesture library to bake an avatar that people would trust. Maya and Malik's first interview with Ebo happened under duress. They found him in the kitchen of his small flat, shrugging into the kind of nervous honesty that is both a confession and a semester of ego. Ebo's story was not one of a mastermind in a darkened lair. It was the story of a gig economy worker who had been recruited into a workflow that hid moral responsibility beneath one-way contracts and escrow accounts. He had sold access to blended voices, a la carte, a bank teller's cadence here, a soft-spoken executive's clipped tones there, sold as verification voices to clients who billed themselves as content studios or performance houses. The clients were not always benign. Maya listened while Ebo fed the bones of the operation. A marketplace that allowed paying customers to assemble scenes. A target's face, a voice clone, a scenario. Buyers could add motion, lighting, micro-terror triggers. Add a deadline, pay the escrow, and the clip was delivered. The most profitable gigs were those that required plausible intimacy. A lover's apology, a sibling's plea, a CEO's hurried consent. Those were the scenarios that broke human resistance. A defining detail in Ebo's account was the quality threshold. "Realism," he said, "is a vector." That single phrase became a compass for Maya. Realism could be tuned, measured, and optimized. The criminals learned which imperfections to leave in and which to erase. Too perfect, and the clip felt uncanny. Too rough, and it was dismissed as cheap fakery. They aimed for the human sweet spot. Back in their office, Maya and Malik compiled a list of incidents that fit the pattern. A local councilwoman had resigned after 6 minutes of leaked footage, showing her in a drunken, compromising confession that the councilwoman swore she had never recorded. A tech startup founder wired $250,000 to a shell company after receiving a video message from what the founders insisted was his father. A teenager in a suburb lost a savings account to extortion after a morphed viral clip showed him saying things he adamantly denied. The connective tissue was clear. Synthetic media used not only for deception but for coercion, scaled by a market that turned intimacy into leverage. As they dug, they found a secondary economy humming in the margins. People selling deniability. Lawyers with anonymous numbers, social media pages promising takedowns, and private consultants who claimed to scrub the deep web. Often these services repackaged the same frauds. For a fee, an operator would produce a fake retraction or a staged apology video. The people who paid these fixers were the very same ones the criminals targeted. The industry had enough vertical integration to make a fraudster's life easy. Maya began to write. She sketched profiles, timelines, and case studies. She found families devastated, careers derailed, and elders hoodwinked out of support. But she also found a peculiar normality to the operation. Victims often blamed themselves first, then the network that enabled the takeover. The sense of shame is a powerful amplifier. Many victims delayed calling authorities because the fake material felt like a betrayal of private life. The synthesis of trust and shame made the frauds especially cruel. The deeper Maya went, the more she realized the problem was not only technology. The problem was the architecture of social verification that humans had built and treated as durable. A phone call from a known voice, a video with a private detail, a time-stamped clip. Those were the things people trusted. The criminals discovered that replicating those trust signals, then weaponizing them, delivered results with bureaucratic efficiency. The first part of Act I ends with Maya publishing a cautious, data-rich report that prompts a small storm of public outrage. It is not yet a national scandal, but it is enough to mobilize the small agencies that handle cybercrime. The story's tendrils are still local. Arrests have not yet been made. The pushback, however, is immediate. PR firms, a few local officials, and social media managers move to discredit the reporting as alarmist. The machine keeps humming. By the time Rosa Almeida walked into Malik's office, the case file had grown heavier than either of them expected. Rosa had been one of the earliest victims to speak publicly. Her clip had been grotesquely intimate, a faux apology in which she seemed to admit to selling company secrets. The recording had coincided with the board's emergency meeting and a precipitous fall in investor confidence. Rosa's pleas and the evidence she provided opened a new line of inquiry. Victims were not only being shamed, they were being weaponized to extract resources from institutions. Rosa told a story that could have come from a manual on gaslighting. She had received a call in the dead hour early one morning. A familiar voice, clipped and warm, saying that a private video of her would be released unless she transferred funds to an account for safekeeping. The voice had been convincingly identical to her partner's. Rosa, terrified, complied. In the morning, she received the doctored clip, the apologetic confession. Then the thieves demanded more. When she tried to contact the person she believed had called her, the voicemail was gone and the messages seemed to come from different numbers. An architecture of plausible continuity. Malik performed a forensic sweep on the files Rosa could produce. He saw the familiar hallmarks, artifacts of synthetic synthesis, an absence of certain analog anomalies that accompany unskilled editing, and the presence of subtler markers that suggested an intelligent, iterative process. Whoever built the clip had access to voice datasets granular enough to render a foolproof impersonation. They also identified transactional evidence, a string of shell companies and a pathway of small transactions that mapped to an offshore processor. The money flowed through a succession of micropayments and concentrated into a few cold wallets. This money trail could be followed only with patience. The perpetrators used a design feature familiar to those who move money in the gray zones of the internet: fragmentation. They chopped large demands into hundreds of small transfers, routing them through intermediaries and mixers. Maya's piece that followed Rosa's testimony, long-form, human-centered, focused on the quiet violence of being impersonated. She asked the question that would anchor the rest of the investigation: what happens to trust when it can be fabricated on demand? Her readers did not need to be technical to understand the cruelty of the mechanism. They felt it in their bones. The piece nudged public officials, and an interagency task force was convened. But momentum is not the same as policy. The task force moved like a bureaucracy: earnest meetings, cautious statements, and an undercurrent of disbelief from stakeholders who found it easier to call it sophistication than to confront structural vulnerability. On the margins of the story, other consequences accumulated. Families split over accusations based on fake evidence. Startups with solid products collapsed because their boards panicked. Small, tightly knit communities found themselves swarmed by misinformation that altered the course of local elections. In every case, the same leverage strategy played out. Synthetic media produced an emotional shock strong enough to overcome a person's rational defense. Shame, confusion, and the social need to preserve reputation turned into an engine. The theoretical vulnerability was simple. Institutions and people validated truth with the wrong signals. A known voice on the phone, a time-stamped video, a screenshot from a supposedly secure chat. The criminals had learned to counterfeit proof. As Maya closed Act I Part 2, she realized the story required more than exposition. It required a new lexicon. She needed to show readers how the frauds were executed, step by step, without teaching them how to commit more harm. The balance was tough. A journalist's ethical problem nested inside a technical investigation. She drafted a long explainer on the psychology of trust, why a voice matters, how microsignals inform judgment, why people are inclined to obey a call from someone whose voice matches their mental model of authority. The explainer ran a week after her Rosa profile, and it shifted the conversation. The public started calling for verification standards, for changes in how banks validated transfers, and for liability on platforms that hosted the fake content. The legal landscape lagged, as legal frameworks often do, caught between centuries-old definitions of fraud and a technology that made deception frictionless. Meanwhile, in quieter corners of the web, the market for synthetic identity continued to flourish. Ebo's role was illustrative. Participants were not always ideologues or masterminds. They were workers in an economy that allowed people to sell discrete skills. Some saw themselves as artisans. Others saw only the rent. The human cost was distributed across the chain, but the benefits were concentrated in the hands of a few operators who treated identity as an assembly line. The problem, as the first act closed, was that society had outsourced trust to brittle signals. The criminals simply learned to craft those signals better than the people who relied on them. With the story now public, the conversation shifted from outrage to response. Maya took the stage at a university panel convened to discuss synthetic harms. The auditorium hummed with a particular modern anxiety. People who had read the pieces wanted to know how to protect themselves. Technologists wanted to explain the limits of detection. Policymakers wanted to appear decisive. In the middle, victims like Rosa sat with the kind of rawness that transformed abstract policy into real consequence. Malik, who had been involved in several months of quiet forensics, spoke about technical markers and legal gaps. He described a world where the usual judicial tools, chain of custody, metadata, witness corroboration, were brittle in the face of synthetic media that could erase its own fingerprints. The conversation turned to solutions: stronger authentication, better platform moderation, mandatory verification for certain classes of digital communications, and the creation of digital watermarks. For every proposed fix, however, there was a counterargument. Clever criminals would adapt. Watermarks could be stripped. Stricter verification could exclude marginalized people. The panel's central tension was one that would recur. Control versus access. The same systems that authenticate identity, secure databases, centralized verification, also present risks of exclusion. For example, refugees, people without formal identification, and those in precarious positions rely on lower-friction identity channels. A new security regime that required biometric checks or central IDs could make their lives harder even as it protected others. Meanwhile, in the back channels Maya had cultivated, she learned of a darker escalation. Criminal operators were no longer satisfied with blackmail alone. They had realized a simple arithmetic. The more believable the fake, the more it could be used to manipulate institutions and markets. A few sophisticated frauds had targeted corporate counsel by generating fake internal memos, apparently authorized by CEOs, that directed finance departments to release funds. Those funds walked through a choreography of mule accounts and disappeared into crypto pipelines. The scale was changing. Where once fraud had required an individual or small team to coax a mark, now it required infrastructures. Code that could produce dozens of variations of a clip for A/B testing. A marketing-like backend that selected which truth signals would be most persuasive for a given demographic. Operator dashboards with metrics like conversion rate and time to compliance. Fraudsters were applying the language and methods of growth hacking to deception. These operational upgrades were not coincidental. The resources needed to run such campaigns, compute clusters, datasets, anonymized voice corpora, were increasingly accessible. Open-source models lowered the threshold. Cloud providers offered computational power on demand. The specialization that once differentiated sophisticated groups from amateurs was eroding. Accessibility meant more attackers, more variants, and a broader surface of victims. Maya's reporting shifted toward systems. She began to look at how markets and platforms mediated trust. The platforms, for their part, published promises. Improved detection models, user reports, and content takedown teams. But the platforms were not neutral. They were businesses. Detection strategies often relied on pattern recognition that favored popular languages and major regions, leaving others exposed. Moreover, takedowns could be gamed. The criminals learned to create plausible counterclaims and to weaponize the takedown appeal process itself. As Act 2 Part 1 closes, the story shows that the problem has matured beyond isolated scams into an ecosystem. The actors include coders, middlemen, platforms, financial conduits, and a growing number of victims. The question no longer is whether synthetic media can deceive. It is who can engineer resilience at scale without harming the vulnerable. The task force convened in a room with seating for a dozen and a mandate that felt both urgent and vague. It included prosecutors and cyberforensic specialists, policy analysts, representatives from platforms, and a handful of civil society actors. The tone was earnest. The process was slow. Members parsed statutory language, debated jurisdiction, and argued about the feasibility of proposed sanctions. A recurrent theme surfaced. Law and technology were speaking different temporal languages. Law works by precedent and classification. Technology evolves by iteration. Malik pushed for a few pragmatic measures that prosecutors could action immediately. Better preservation orders for digital evidence, expedited cooperation protocols with cloud providers, and targeted training for local police units to recognize signs of synthetic impersonation. He also argued for a pilot program that would embed forensic liaisons in major banks to prevent payments made under duress. His logic was straightforward. Money moves quickly. If you slow or block that movement, you blunt the operation. Platform representatives, for their part, emphasized detection pipelines and voluntary transparency. They published white papers about improved machine learning models but remained vague on enforcement thresholds. Their argument was consistent with business incentives. Less harm equals better public sentiment, but aggressive removal risks user backlash and regulatory scrutiny. Civil society voices worried about overreach. They cautioned against sweeping surveillance techniques that treated everyone as a suspect. The vulnerability of marginalized communities was a recurring concern. Systems built to verify identity can exclude those who lack stable documentation. The policy trade-offs were knotty. There were no easy wins that didn't create collateral harm. Parallel to the policy work, Maya kept reporting. Her long-form pieces now tracked the economics. How payoffs were structured, how money flowed, and who profited. She found that a small set of operators optimized the money flows with industrial precision. They relied on registered companies that operated as intermediaries, nominally legitimate firms that provided digital content services, while acting as conduits for fraud. In some instances, legitimate companies had been infiltrated, their service offerings repurposed as cover. One twist made the human toll acute. Maya uncovered a campaign aimed not at wealth extraction but at political manipulation. Synthetic clips were used to manufacture a scandal that shifted media coverage and voter sentiment in a municipality where elections were tight. The scandal didn't have the economic logic of ransom. Instead, it used the same technology to make a falsehood look inevitable, to create a cascade of belief. The tools of personal extortion and political manipulation were now identical. Rosa became a public face for legislative change, giving testimony to a committee that convened to consider new protections. Her testimony was rough and candid. She recounted the moment she had handed over money, the paralysis that came with fear, and the ongoing sense that the legal system was slow to recognize the full contours of harm. Her voice, live and human, was a counterpoint to the synthetic tones that had cost her so much. The hearing made headlines, but hearings are not laws. They are ceremonies that sometimes coax legislation into being. At the end of Act 2, Part 2, the task force publishes a set of recommended actions: enhanced digital evidence preservation tools, voluntary platform standards for flagged synthetic content, and a proposal to classify coercive synthetic impersonation as an aggravated form of extortion in certain jurisdictions. The recommendations were a start. The harder work remained: enforcement, international cooperation, and the redesign of social verification practices. The machine had already adapted. Policy needed to be nimble. Act 3 opens with an escalation that everyone had privately feared. A coordinated campaign that fused financial fraud, political manipulation, and personal extortion. The operators, no longer content with quick ransoms, had learned to sequence trust-destroying events across multiple targets. In one iteration, a synthetic apology video would drop for an influential public figure. As the story went viral, an apparently unrelated extortion campaign would hit local business owners with fabricated loan default videos, pushing them into panic sales. The pattern resembled a stress test designed to measure social fragility. Ebo, sitting in a dim warehouse, began to crack. The moral calculus that had seemed distant at the job's outset collapsed under the weight of direct harm. He had never intended to catalyze a political crisis or to help bankrupt a chain of small businesses. He had seen the flux of money, felt the immediate relief that it brought in his own life, and then watched the aftermath. A family displaced, a councilman's career ruined on false pretenses, a charity that had supported neighborhood programs vanish overnight. The human fallout tracked him like a shadow. He started to leak small fragments of the pipeline to people he trusted. Those leaks were imperfect and messy, but they gave investigators a foothold. Malik and his team began to map the delivery pipeline. There were repositories of voice datasets scraped from publicly available videos and social media. There were assembled persona kits that paired face assets with voice prints and gesture presets. There were automated A/B testing modules that tested which configuration produced the largest compliance rate for a target demographic. There were also, crucially, human operators who handled the final delivery and negotiated with victims. The pipeline was hybrid: automated engines plus human negotiators and money launderers. Tracing money across borders remained painful. The operators used multiple layers of service providers, payment processors, microtransaction splintering, and the conversion of fiat into cryptocurrency through small exchanges. In some instances, They inserted legitimate freelancers into the chain to provide the appearance of genuine commerce. It was entire infrastructure that economized deception. Malik's team, with the leaks from Ebo and a handful of other insiders, started to identify the core entities. They executed carefully planned operations, coordinating with financial regulators and global partners. The raids were surgical in places where access and legal authority permitted it, and delayed in places where jurisdictional gaps created safe harbors. Arrests were made in 2 cities. The operators in those locales were mid-level, technical leads, money movement specialists, and a few purported buyers. The kingpins, if they existed, retreated into an architecture of intermediaries that insulated them from direct exposure. What emerged in this phase of the story was a profound asymmetry. Law enforcement worked in networks of accountability defined by borders and warrants. The criminals had built a lattice that exploited those same borders. Where law used paper chains and subpoenas, the criminals used ephemeral accounts and anonymized infrastructure. The contest was not only technical, it was geopolitical. The public response was varied. Some insisted on draconian measures, heavy surveillance, mandatory biometric checks, and sweeping content bans. Others insisted on digital rights, resisting measures that would create permanent, centralized registries of biometric data. The debate turned partisan in some quarters, with techno-panic and civil libertarian sentiments colliding. Amid the politics, the human stories anchored the narrative. Maya continued to profile victims and the investigators who pursued the case. She wrote about the boredom of long investigations, the breakthrough moments, like when a single wallet address triangulated with a public company invoice, and the quiet courage of witnesses who testified. Her pieces tried to do 2 things simultaneously: to name the harm and to map the institutional responses that could prevent future iterations. As Act 3 Part 1 closes, the story's tension tightens. Arrests, splintered infrastructure, and a deeper understanding of how scale and social engineering coalesce. But the kingpins remained shadowy. The net had narrowed, but the machine had not been fully dismantled. The public relations moment arrived in stages. The task force convened a press conference and announced a set of coordinated arrests. They released sparse details. A number of mid-level operatives detained, some servers seized, several wallet addresses frozen. The headlines cheered. But behind the scripted victory lay the reality that the machine's most dangerous feature, its replicability, had not been destroyed. Arrests forced a flurry of opportunistic openings in the criminal ecosystem. New operators could step into vacuums. The game now included resilience planning on both sides. Maya's reporting during Act 3 Part 2 focused on accountability and the hard lessons of enforcement. She scrutinized the task force's claims, dug into the evidence presented in court, and followed the money. The legal processes were messy and public, good for transparency but also a risk for victims. Some victims wanted the attention because they sought justice. Others recoiled from the glare because it amplified shame. The court hearings forced an awkward truth. The law could name individual perpetrators, but it lacked a toolkit to dismantle the architecture that allowed their acts to repeat. Ebo, who had cooperated with investigators, testified in camera against several operators. His testimony was both a confession and a chronicle. He described the moment he realized how far the harm went, and the moment he found the decency to begin undoing some of it. His cooperation accelerated some prosecutions and revealed the marketplace's inner workings. Yet the kingpins, the architects who designed the system's incentives, were still far from captured. The public conversation matured. Where panic had once dominated, a second wave of pragmatic thinking emerged. Banks strengthened verification by adding friction on transactions flagged by context. Sudden changes in recipient profile, transfers following the release of damaging media, or requests initiated at odd hours. Platforms began to trial provenance labels for media, requiring origin metadata for video uploads beyond a given reach. Civil society groups pushed for harm-first policy design, interventions focused on protecting victims rather than punishing content. There was a sense that the world had learned a lesson about the intersection of trust and technology. Nevertheless, adaptive threats persisted. Some criminals shifted strategies to exploit new attack vectors like synthetic social engineering calls to banks using cloned voices of authorized signatories. Others invested in localized narratives designed to exploit social or ethnic fissures. The lens through which the problem was viewed had to expand. It was not merely a technological problem but a societal fragility problem. Where social cohesion is thin, synthetic manipulations bite deeper. As the story rounded toward its end, Maya and Malik reflected on the limits of the story they could tell. The arrests and policy changes had mattered, yet the system that incentivized deception had not been fully rewired. The generation of tools that made deepfakes possible also produced new allies. Defenders building provenance standards, privacy-preserving authentication techniques, and community-driven verification networks. There was no magic bullet. There was, instead, a recognition that resilience would need to be engineered into the social architectures of trust. Act 3 Part 2 ends with the acknowledgement that the fight would be ongoing. The arrests were a symbolic win. The systemic battle was now about redesign, education, and deterrence. The criminals had introduced a new grammar of harm. Society would have to learn a new grammar of defense. Months after the headlines faded, life resumed its difficult rhythms. The legal process continued in courtrooms that favored slow, deliberative work. The task force published a first set of metrics suggesting a short-term reduction in high-profile synthetic extortion cases. Platforms refined their detection algorithms and launched educational campaigns about media provenance. Banks implemented new friction measures that made certain transactions more costly but safer. Maya and Malik sat in a cafe and folded the case's long appendices into a neat stack. They were both tired in the way people are after running a marathon without a finish line. Satisfied with small victories, uneasy about the persistent threats still alive in the margins. They had seen the human cost up close and had tried to convert that cost into a public good policy, awareness, technical defenses. They had also learned the limits of any one actor to fix systemic problems alone. That epilogue is not tidy. Cannot be. The technology that enabled the frauds also enabled defenses. It is the dual nature of tools. The same models that generate deception also empower authenticity. Improved watermarking, differential privacy tools that protect datasets, and private attestation systems that help verify provenance without centralizing power. The narrative's arc bends toward an uneasy equilibrium. More capability in the hands of more people, more harm and more defense. What the story leaves behind, beyond arrests and policy memos, is a set of lessons stitched into the civic fabric. Individuals learn to pause before obeying a voice-only request. Institutions added contextual checks for abnormal transfers. Platforms began to surface provenance signals. The conversation about trust changed tone from fatalism to design. Trust could be redesigned to be harder to fake. Maya's reporting continued. She kept naming harms and tracking policy outcomes. Malik expanded his team and trained local investigators in new techniques. Ebo, in a quieter life, began consulting on ethical AI curricula and community defense workshops. Rosa rebuilt parts of her life. The scars were real, but she told her story to encourage systemic change. The city outside the cafe kept humming, oblivious to the complex choreography of human beings, law, and code that had just played out in its shadow. The machine that made impersonation easy had not been destroyed. It had been understood better and constrained in some critical domains. That understanding, and the systems and norms that grew from it, would define the next chapter.